When I was at college, at Bible college, our family lived across the road from our college, which came in very, very handy. There are many benefits to living that close to the place that you study, or if you live that close to the place that you work. One primary benefit is that you can sleep in. And then at the last moment, you can just run across the road and you'll be there for when you need to be there. Except one morning at college, the night before, I forgot to set my alarm. And when I woke up in the morning, I realised I was already 15 minutes late to an important lecture. So I jumped out of bed and I grabbed the clothes that were lying on the floor from the day before and I put it on and I raced across the road, ready to get in there, at least to get to the end of the lecture. And when I walked into the classroom, one of my good friends pulled me aside and said, "Mike, I don't know if you know this, but your underpants are hanging out the bottom of your jeans." I went, "What?" And then I looked down, and when you're in that semi-sleep, semi-awake state, and you're like, "I'm sure I put underpants on this morning. I don't know how they got down there." And then it hit me. Because I was so rushed, because I slept in and I just put on yesterday's clothes. Yesterday's clothes, of course, had the old underpants still sitting there in the bottom of the jeans, and I walked out in public with it hanging there at the bottom of my legs. How embarrassing. I quickly pulled them out and shoved them into my bag and tried to pretend that everything was okay. We all have moments that we regret. We all have made decisions that we would like to go back in time and change if we could. Maybe you haven't had that exact embarrassing moment that I did, but I'm sure that you've had your fair share of moments that you would like to forget. And of course, there are some moments, some decisions that we make that we can't simply just laugh off. Thank you for laughing with me tonight and hopefully not at me. But there are some mistakes that we've made that we can't simply just laugh off. The influential leader, the political leader, or the church leader that's caught in an illicit affair, you can't just laugh that off. The professional athlete that's caught doping, that's not just a mistake. The businessman that's caught cooking the books, no, you can't just laugh that off. They are significant moral failures. And then there are the things that you are ashamed of. There are the things that I am ashamed of that nobody knows. And you know what I'm talking about, don't you? And all of these moments, moment by moment, event by event, well, it can feel a little bit like my backpack here. You put all the regrets that you've made in the past in your backpack, one event after another, one moment after another, and you carry that around with you. It gets so exhausting, doesn't it? Living with all those past mistakes. And you long to be able to just throw it off. You long to be free of the burdens of the past, but can you? Where do you even start? Well, in our Kings and Prophets series, we're in week 2, part 2 of Kings and Prophets. And tonight we're zooming in on the life of King David. Last week we started the series looking at Israel's first king, King Saul, and he was a failure. He was the king that the people wanted, but he wasn't the king that the people needed. And God came to him through the prophet Samuel and said, "I'm going to give the throne to another, a man after my own heart," says God, a man that God chooses. And that is, as we see today, King David. He's the young shepherd boy, the youngest in his family. He is chosen by God to be the king of his people. And if you know the story of King David, you know that he starts out so well. He is loyal. He is brave. You remember the story of David and Goliath? Everybody remembers the story of David and Goliath, the little shepherd boy with the slingshot and cuts off the giant's head. It's a great kid story. And everybody loves that story. And he was blessed. He was loyal, he was brave, and he was blessed. Blessed by God even. So in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God makes this incredible promise of blessing to King David. Listen to these words. It's the prophet Nathan that is speaking them to him. When your time comes and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. This is an incredible promise that God makes to King David, that one of his descendants is going to be king forever. Is going to be the king of a kingdom that never ends. A forever king in a forever kingdom. And of course, the rest of the Bible, if you've been in church for any period of time, if you've read the Bible, you know that in many ways what happens in the Bible after King David is an unfolding revelation trying to answer that question, who is this forever king going to be? Who is it going to be? But even great King David, as blessed as he wasn't perfect. And he had a significant moral failure. Not just a whoops moment, not just a, oh, that wasn't a great thing to do, a significant moral failure. And it marred the record of his entire life. In fact, even after David died, as people look back and reflected on King David, in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 5, this is long after David has died, someone writes an obituary, if you like, to King David's life. This is what he's remembered for. Hear these words. David did what was right in the Lord's eyes, and he did not turn aside from anything he had commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. David was great. He was so good. He always did what God told him to do, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. That is what David has become known for. What happened? Well, you might know the story. And it's in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Let me summarize it for you. David commits adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of David's mightiest men, one of his elite soldiers, special forces, if you like. Bathsheba then falls pregnant, and David tries to cover it up, and when that doesn't work, he orchestrates the death of Uriah so that he can then take Bathsheba as his own wife and pretend that everything is okay. If Saul last week broke some of the first commandments of the 10 Commandments, all about honouring God and respecting God and not taking the place of God, then David breaks every other commandment. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not covet your neighbour's wife. All of them David broke. Now, there have been many sex scandals in ancient history and modern history. So much so that when you hear another one, even one like this that was written 3,000 years ago, you can feel a little numb, like, well, that happens all the time. And you might think, well, what does it mean for me? How is it relevant for my life? I'm never going to have the power of a King David to abuse my power like that. What's this story got to do with me? Well, I think it would be naive to think that this story doesn't teach us anything. Someone once said that the only difference between King David's sin and your sin and my sin is resources. You know, if we had the resources of King David, don't fool yourself into thinking that you may have been better. The same desire for power, lust, and greed flows through all of our veins. The only difference between David and us is resources. And so I think there are a number of things that we can learn from David's moral failure. The first is this, and I've got 7 of them, so straddle up. Number 1, the context of sin. The context of sin. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, David wasn't where he should be. The author tells us that it was the time of the year when kings march off to war. And David has sent his army off to war, but David was not with them. He decided to stay home. He's not where he should have been. Now, this might have been okay if David was staying at home to look after his own people, to, look after home affairs. But in chapter 11, verse 2, that's not what David's doing. The author tells us he's lying on his bed. He's having an evening nap. And when he wakes up, he walks around because he's got nothing else to do. And then his gaze falls upon a vulnerable woman. A woman in his kingdom who he ought to have protected, but now he pursues. Friends, a lesson here for us. Sin often comes to us and tempts us when we are not where we ought to be, or we're not doing what we ought to be doing. Staying late at the office when you ought to be at home with your family. or staying home alone instead of going to church or discipleship group, and you've got nothing better to do, so you pull out your phone, you look up that website on your laptop, and soon enough you've fallen into temptation. We may not be David, but we do put ourselves into situations that we ought not put ourselves in. Situations that aren't just unhelpful, but potentially dangerous. The context of sin not being where you ought to be. The second lesson, the centre of sin. What did David do? David sees, David wants, and David takes. And the author in chapter 11, verse 27 says that what David did was evil in the eyes of the Lord. That's the centre of David's sin, that what he did was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And it's not just evil because of the hurt and the pain that he caused others, and he did cause incredible hurt, incredible pain to others, to Bathsheba, to Uriah, to the poor people that knew what was going on and then were too scared to speak up about it. David caused an incredible amount of hurt and pain to others. But his evil is much deeper than that. In chapter 12, verse 7, when the prophet Nathan comes to him, this is what Nathan says, and I'll paraphrase it. This is what the Lord says. I gave you this, David, and I gave you this, and I gave you that. I gave, and if you would have asked, I would have given you even more, David. But you have despised the word of the Lord, verse 9, and so have despised me, says the Lord, verse 10. You see, at the centre of David's sin was not just what he did to Bathsheba or to Uriah or to others, but at the centre was that he was turning away from the Lord of all. David was God's king. In many ways, he had everything, but he wanted more. A bit like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They had everything that was good. And then when the snake came to them and tempted them and said, you can have more, that desire was too much to resist. That's what David is doing here. God has made him king, has given him almost everything, and David says, it's not enough. I want what I can't have. I want more. He wasn't satisfied with God's provision. And friends, every sin, whether it's public or private, at the centre of it is that. A turning away from God, a rejecting of his provisions. It's a kicking him out of the driver's seat and wanting to take control of the wheel yourself. That's at the centre of all sin. And we all do it. Our sins might be more socially acceptable than David's, but at its centre is the exact same thing. The centre of sin. The third lesson we see here is the complication of sin. Having had his one-night stand with a beautiful young woman, David may have felt initially powerful and pleased, but not long after, David hears those words from Bathsheba that would change his life. David, I'm pregnant. I'm pregnant. Words which in the ordinary sense ought to be words of great joy. What husband or wife doesn't want to hear those words? I'm pregnant. We've been trying for ages and now God has answered our prayers. I'm pregnant. But in the wrong context, those words aren't words of great joy, but they can be words of incredible sorrow. Sin always has a way of complicating life, taking something that is good and messing it up, a giant tangled mess. And maybe you know that experience in your own life. You have complicated family relationships now because of mistakes that have been made in the past. You have a complicated workplace arrangement because of the sins of the past. Maybe your own personal life is messy and tangled because of your own mistakes in the past. Sin always complicates. And for David, it's going to get even more tangled when he starts to cover it up. And that's lesson 4, the cover-up of sin. No doubt if David lived today with the power that he had, he may have tried to coerce Bathsheba into getting an abortion. because that's what you do in the modern West. But his solution was this. He calls Uriah home, he throws a party to get Uriah drunk, and then he tries to persuade Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife Bathsheba. And then when he discovers magically that she's pregnant, it must be his, and David can get away scot-free. But it doesn't work. Uriah doesn't comply. In fact, in a moment of incredible irony, Uriah says to David, "How can I go home and be with my wife when the army is at war?" Why is that ironic? Because that's what David should be doing. He should be at war with his fighting men, but where is he? At home. Not with his wife, with Uriah's wife. An incredible moment of irony comparing Uriah and David. And so plan A doesn't work for David, so he enacts plan B, where he sends Uriah back to the battle and asks his officers to place Uriah at the front lines where the fighting is fiercest. And of course, Uriah dies. Well, actually, when Nathan confronts David about his sin, he says to David, "You killed Uriah. Yeah, you weren't there, but you killed him through the sword of the Ammonites." Friends, what we see here, I think, and it's an important lesson for us to understand, is that sin covered up often just leads to more sin. And I think we know this. You know, you tell one lie, and then often you have to tell another lie to cover up the first lie, and then another lie, and then another lie, and then another lie. And it can be really tiring, can't it? Really exhausting trying to remember all the lies. It's much easier to tell the truth. You don't have to remember too much. Worse, we can even start to believe our own lies and become hardened to them. And I think we see that in David. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, when he hears the news that Uriah is dead from one of his officers, David's reply to the officer is this: "Don't let this matter upset you." Oh, how nice, David. "Don't let this matter upset you, because the sword devours all alike." Can you see what's happened to David? Not only has he tried to cover up his own mistakes, he's now blind to the effects of it. Sin covered up just often leads to more sin, and then a blindness to it and a hardness in your own heart. And I'm sure you know that too. Lesson 5, the confrontation of sin. David may have initially believed he got away with one, but of course he knows what he's done. There are others that know what he has done, whether they're too scared to speak up about it. But of course, there is one that sees all, and that is God himself. And so God confronts David through Nathan. And Nathan's confrontation with David starts out with Nathan telling us this story. And it may have felt a bit weird to you. Nathan tells David, "Hey, David, there's this story of a rich man and a poor man, and the poor man has a little ewe lamb, and the rich man steals it off him." And whether God told Nathan to tell David that story or whether Nathan made it up, I don't really know. But in the end, it is a very cleverly designed story because it puts David's defences down, and David ends up condemning himself as a result. Listen to the words again, 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 5. "David was infuriated with the man in the story and said to Nathan, 'As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die, because he has done this thing and shown no pity. He must pay 4 lambs for that lamb.' And Nathan replied to David, 'You are the man, David.'" Now, when somebody says to us, "Gentlemen, you're the man," often we can be filled with power, and we're proud, and it's a wonderful moment, but that's not the experience that David felt here with Nathan. When Nathan says to David, "You," it's an emphatic you, David, are the man. You have just condemned yourself. It's a moment of humiliation. It's a pointed, sharp, "You are the man." Friends, your sin, this is the lesson, will always be found out. Numbers 32 verse 23 says, "Be sure your sin will catch up with you." We will all be confronted by our own sin at some point. We can be very good at hiding it from others, maybe even pretending that it's not there in our own mind and heart. But we cannot hide it from God, and one day it will be brought into the light. Maybe like David, that'll happen in this life, and if you think you can get away with it for your whole life, well, maybe you can. But then you'll stand before God on that day when everyone will stand before his throne and the books of life are opened and every deed will be then brought into the light. If you haven't yet been caught out, if your sin hasn't caught up with you just yet, it's only a matter of time. We will all be confronted with our sin. So imagine that you are David right now. You're the man, David. Well, it's not quite like that, is it? What might be going through your mind? Well, I didn't like what you just told me, Nathan, but I am the king. I can do whatever I like. So, Nathan, this is your last day on earth. I'm going to kill you. Well, I tried that with Uriah, and that obviously didn't work. So maybe I won't do that. Maybe I can come up with a story. I can plead my case. I can say, even as a king, there are moments where I get lonely and I know Bathsheba wasn't my wife, but, it was just one of those moments of weakness. I was just lonely and tired and she was there and she met a need that I had and, I shouldn't have done it, but I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and one thing led to another and explain it away, justify our action. We can be very good at that too, can't we? You might remember last week with King Saul when Samuel confronted him. That's exactly what Saul did. Oh, Samuel, I'm sorry, but it wasn't my fault. It was the circumstances around me that led me to do this. David doesn't do that here in 2 Samuel chapter 12. This is what separates David from Saul, I think. When David is confronted with the truth, the reality of his sin, he doesn't try and cover it up anymore. He knows he's been exposed. He doesn't try and explain it away. He confesses. And that's lesson 6, the confession of sin. David responds in verse 13, I have sinned. I have sinned against the Lord. It's only a very short sentence, a very simple confession. But actually later in the Bible, David writes a lot of the Psalms, you might know that. And in Psalm 51, we have a more extended confession of David in reference to this event with Bathsheba and Uriah. Let me read to you a few of those verses from the start of Psalm 51. This is David's confession. His reply to you are the man. Be gracious to me, God, according to your faithful love, according to your abundant compassion. Blot out my rebellion, wash away my guilt, and cleanse me from my sin. For I am conscious of my rebellion, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you alone I have sinned and done this evil in your sight. Can you feel the emotion in David's voice? This is a bit more than I have sinned against the Lord. David knows what he has done is wrong. I think his heartfelt confession here where he says, my sin is always before me. I wonder whether that indicates that David has been walking around with his bag of regret, filled with the guilt and shame. Yeah, he's tried to cover it up. Yeah, he's tried to pretend that it's not there, but he knows that it's there. And he's been walking around with this burden on his back. And I wonder whether his heartfelt confession is an indication that he's almost relieved that his sin has now been exposed and brought into the light. That he doesn't need to carry it anymore. That it's already been brought out into the light. He doesn't need to pretend. Someone once told me that recently when they got COVID, it almost felt like a relief to them. Because now they could stop just worrying about when it might happen and wondering where it's going to happen, all those kind of questions. And when they got it, it was almost like a relief. They didn't have to worry about that anymore. They just had to focus on getting better and managing it. I don't know if that's been anybody else's experience with that virus. But people have felt similar relief when their web of lies have become public. For the exhaustion of trying to cover up one lie with another lie and another lie, they realise there's now a burden that they don't need to carry because everybody now knows. But for God's people, confession is not merely therapeutic to make you feel better about yourself. Confession is actually transformative. Transformative. And that's the last lesson, the comfort for sinners. David confesses, and then Nathan immediately replies in 2 Samuel 12, verse 13, these words of great comfort. David, the Lord has taken away your sin. Just listen to that again. David, the Lord has taken away your sin. There is no long pause between David's confession and the Lord's forgiveness. I don't think we're meant to see God straining in heaven. Oh, okay, I'll forgive you. David confesses, he humbles himself, turns from his sin, and God immediately forgives him. Incredible grace. Why? Why? Well, David later in Psalm 103 tells us why. And it's got nothing to do with David. It's got nothing to do with his heart, but God's. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and rich in faithful love. He will not always accuse us or be angry forever. He has not dealt with us as our sins deserve or repaid us according to our offences. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his faithful love toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Why did God forgive David? Because God loves him. And compassion and grace are the very heart of God. Sin is serious. I hope you've seen that from 2 Samuel 11 and 12. That sin is serious. It's messy, it's complicated. But grace is majestic. Sin is serious, but grace is majestic. And the same is true for you and for me. And we can know God's grace with more certainty and clarity than I think David even knew. David didn't know how God could take away his sin. We do. We do. In preserving David's life, it would pave the way for the King of Kings to be born 1,000 years later. A king who was tempted just like David, but remained faithful to God. A king who would offer up his perfect life as the perfect sacrifice for everybody's sin. David's included, yours included, mine included. I don't know if you've been trying to cover up your sin recently or pretend that it doesn't exist. Maybe you have been walking around with a big load on your back, a bag full of regrets, of all past mistakes, even present ones. The shame and guilt is a real burden on your back. Friends, it doesn't need to be. Do you remember what Jesus said to his disciples? Come, all of you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Friends, come to Jesus again tonight. Lay your bag of guilt and regret at the cross and let him take it away for you. In 1 John 1 verse 9, there is this promise, a beautiful promise of comfort for all Christians. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, he is faithful and righteous to forgive us and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That is a great promise. Now, this promise doesn't mean that we won't have to live with the effects of our past mistakes. It doesn't mean that the scars of the past will suddenly disappear. We might be forgiven. We may not have to bear the guilt or the shame anymore, but the scars might still be there. And that was definitely the case for David. David had opened the gates of abuse and death in his family, in his household, and that would be the pattern that would follow after him, starting with Bathsheba's baby, and then moving into David's sons, Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah would all die by the sword. David called for death in that story that Nathan told, and he called for a fourfold payment of lambs to the poor person. Well, David didn't die. God saved him from death. But he still experienced the fourfold payment in his own family. And you and I will still have to live with the consequences of our mistakes. You know, say the church treasurer is caught stealing money from the safe. Can they be forgiven? Of course they can be. God can forgive us all. We could forgive that person. But does that mean that they could ever be the treasurer again? Probably not. The husband that is caught cheating on his wife. Can the Lord forgive him? Absolutely. We've seen it in 2 Samuel 12. Can the wife forgive him? Maybe. Yes, that is possible. Does that mean that they'll all live happily ever after? Maybe not. Separation and divorce might still happen, even though you know you are forgiven. We might have to live with our scars. Do you know that Jesus, who bore the weight of guilt of the world, suffered in our place? He's in heaven now. He still bears the scars of that sacrifice. We might have to live with those scars as well. But those scars will never have the final word. The final word is God saying to you, I love you. I sent my son to die for you. I have raised him from the grave. If you put your trust in him, your guilt, your shame does not need to be your burden anymore. Trust me. I love you. That's the final word. I don't know if you've ever read the book Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. He used the same illustration of the burden on your back. And I love the way that he puts it. Up this road, therefore, did Christian run, but not without great difficulty, because of the load on his back. He ran thus till he came to a place somewhat ascending, and upon that place stood a cross, and a little below it a sepulchre. Just as Christian came up to the cross, his burden loosed from his shoulders and fell from off his back, and began to tumble, and so continued to do till it came to the mouth of the sepulchre, where it fell in, and I saw it no more. It's a beautiful illustration. Sin is serious, yes, but grace is majestic. David knew that grace. And if you've been carrying a load of guilt on your back, tonight's the night you can take it off, lay it at the cross, and it will be taken away, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Isn't that good news?